money and something where you won't see a return for 5 or 10 years. Second is the high cost. It is not uncommon. You look at Elon Musk and SpaceX, if you know that project, that's going to cost $300, $400, $500 million to come to market. And so, as I'll show you later, VCs, venture capitalists, are just not comfortable. They're not going to put in more than 10, 15, 20 million on an unproven product. That's going to take 5 to 10 years to come to market. And oh, by the way, the total cost of the package is $200, $300, $400, $500, $700 million. And finally, unique in our industry is for the past 15 or 20 years, we've had a situation where the governmental agency responsible for this market has been a competitor. And it's hard for a lot of people to understand. I mean, we all have this really nice feeling towards NASA. It's a wonderful brand. You say NASA, everybody, you say Disney, it's just nice stuff. But for those of us who have been fighting in this industry, every time we go into the marketplace with something new and something imaginative, NASA has been there to kill it and make sure that their programs are the ones that continue and not the entrepreneurial companies. Very quickly, my own experience is I started off in Wall Street and took part in setting up the first space fund in commercial space. It was for $10 million. And as germane to the conversation tonight, we lost every penny. We invested in 3 projects. One was a launch vehicle, one was a satellite navigation, and the second was principally a new type of satellite. And in each case, there were political factors that killed the project. And then I was brought in during the Reagan administration to establish something called the Office of Space Commerce. And that was very important because it was the first time that there was a civilian shop, policy shop, in the federal government that was not NASA. And the way it works most of the time is that when the president has a question about space, NASA goes into the Oval Office. But maybe it's a question about astronomy. Okay. Maybe it's a question about the space station. But maybe it's a question about how come there aren't more American space companies. Still, it's NASA that walks into the Oval Office. And that's what we tried to change. And what we tried to do is to make sure that it was the Commerce Department that would have authority over handling and stimulating American businesses to get involved in space. And then also, it's not just manned space. I worked with the advisor. I worked as an advisor to the chairman of a company called Pan Amsat. And up until about 2 decades ago, if you wanted to make a long-distance phone call, let's say from Europe to the States, you had to go into something that was called a PTT. And it was like a big hall that had phone booths, and you took a number, and you went in, and finally you called home, and it would cost like 10, 15, 20 bucks a minute. And the reason is it was government controlled. There was an intergovernmental organization called Intelsat. And there was this, it started by Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, as a Cold War, we had to fight the Soviets, and the Soviets had something called Intersputnik, so we had something called Intelsat. And all the free-loving nations of the world were part of Intelsat, and meant that if you wanted to make an international call or data across boundaries, you went through their organization. And I worked for this crazy Mexican-American businessman named Rene Anselmo, who really wanted to send soap operas from the States to Mexico. And he found out that it was expensive, and he couldn't do it. And he fought the government. And finally, it got down to we couldn't get permission. And finally, he launched the first satellite with no permission to use it. It went on board a French rocket, an Ariane 4. He bought a satellite that had been returned from space because it didn't work. And he got it for a cheap price. He was worth $100 million. He spent $100 million on the launch and the satellite. He couldn't afford insurance. And a friend of mine was down at the launch, and his son, he was standing next to Rene's son, and as they're counting down, Rene's son turned to my friend and said, well, here goes the inheritance. I mean, but it worked. And I'm embarrassed to say that the first nation to give permission was Great Britain, UK. The second was Germany, and we were third. And that's very embarrassing to me. We were only the third nation to take this great American entrepreneurial effort. And because of Rene, Intelsat regime collapsed. Ventures like CNN became realistic because now you could quickly send 30 seconds and it wasn't that expensive from, the Middle East to Atlanta or wherever. And Rene's son didn't do that badly. The company went public for over $1 billion. So it worked out well. And then I got involved with the Russians. I'll tell you more about this. We were approached by a company, and we helped in the Reagan administration bring about the first venture between a commercial space company, a pharmaceutical company, and the Soviet Union. And we had to hide it from NASA. We snuck it through the system because NASA would never permit a commercial company to do space work that didn't involve the NASA programs. Then quickly things began to change. A few years after that, about 92, I got involved with NASA, and I carried over the first contract between NASA and the Soviets, and I'll go through that. And then, as Gregory said, I became head of, jump to the next one, but I became head of a company called MirCorp, which leased the Russian space station Mir. And we signed Dennis Tito, the space tourist, and I'll go through that quickly. And then I left the industry, and I've come back to do this NanoRacks. So I want to give it one more try. I think NASA now is primed to support commercial space ventures. Looking backwards a little bit, in the 80s, there was the first revolution in space. And Reagan announced that, and NASA announced that it was going to be a commercial era. And we all believed NASA. We were foolish. We were like, okay, NASA says it's going to be a commercial era. And so all these entrepreneurial ventures started up. Three that were very well known at the time was the Conestoga 1, which was started by Deke Slayton, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. And it launched a rocket off the coast of Texas. And the paperwork was awful. The regulatory issues were awful. NASA would not support this in any way, and it just simply folded and went out of business. A second project was called external tanks, and it was an idea that the external tank of the space shuttle is discarded. It burns up in the atmosphere. And a number of entrepreneurs said, wait a second, why don't we keep it going a few more seconds, and it would enter orbit, and we could use that as the basis of a space station. It's just a simple idea. Well, NASA fought it tooth and nail, and it never went anywhere. There were 2 or 3 external tank ventures. They had capital, they had support, but it never went anywhere, and they had to shut down. A third was called Space Industries, and it was started by 2 American heroes. One, Dr. Max Faget, who was one of the on the patent for the Mercury capsule, and the other was astronaut Joe Allen. They had an idea for a space station, small. It would take 2 shuttle missions to erect, they called it the Industrial Space Facility. Cost $700 million. Put it up on 2 shuttle flights. Let's see if industry wants to use the zero gravity of space. Simple idea. NASA shut it down. So that was the period of the 80s, and there were a dozen more companies, and each one fell apart principally because you had the competition from the government. But there was one guy who said, you know something, there's a different way we can do this. And that was my friend Anthony Arrett, who is Dr. Anthony Arrett at a Boston company called Payload Systems. And one day in 1987, they were frustrated because the Challenger accident had grounded the space shuttle fleet. And they had pharmaceutical companies that wanted to do drug research in zero gravity. And folks at Payload Systems literally went to Washington from Boston, went up to the Soviet embassy, knocked on the door of the Soviet embassy, and said, we want to talk to your scientific attaché. We hear you have this new Soviet space station, the Mir, which had been launched the year before. We'd like to do commercial research on it. They met with the Soviets. They went back to go to the metro, to go to National Airport. They got lost. They turned around, and they asked the woman behind them, how do you get to the metro? And the woman said, I'll tell you if you tell me what you were doing at the Soviet embassy. So that was the beginning of Payload Systems. They signed commercially in secret with the Soviets to do 2 missions on board the brand new space station. They then came to me and told me, I was now on my 1-year stint with the Reagan administration, and they said, how do we get an export license? And we spent, and I think we'll go into a bit later as well, but part of what you often have to accomplish in Washington, you have to be very clever and realize what you have to do. And we sat there at Commerce and said, this is an important project. And so we snuck it through. We got permission from the Department of Defense, and we got permission from our agency, the Commerce Department, and we got Payload Systems the export license. And the story broke in the New York Times and in all the newspapers of the world, and there was bedlam. NASA was crazy. State Department went crazy. And now Senator Nelson held a press conference and said, this is wrong, and he was right. He was correct. And why is it that an American company, first off, why is it that Payload Systems had to go to Russia? That's a little bit embarrassing. Why is it that we had to sneak it past NASA and the State Department? And that's been the situation in the space industry for the past couple of decades, where NASA has insisted on having control over the operations, design, development, and most aspects of space. But it really started early on with Anthony Arrett and his willingness to act as a business person. And they paid a contract price to the Soviets, and people were asking, how much is it? And Payload Systems said, that's a secret. Payload was allowed to keep their IP. In those days, you couldn't with NASA. If you were working with NASA and you had IP, you had to share it with the American public. And in every case, it was the Soviets in 1988, 1989, 1990 who behaved like business people. This was the time of perestroika, and they understood what we needed, and it was NASA insisting on open control, sharing of information. The government would direct the operations, so it was really a role reversal. Yuri Semyonov. It surprised for me still to say this, but for almost 7 years, this very loyal Soviet, later Russian patriot, head of the largest Russian space organization, he was my boss. And he was a pretty tough hombre, I'll tell you. But he grasped early on in 87, 88, the Soviet Union space program is collapsing. The whole society is collapsing. And Semyonov grasped early on that for him to survive, he had to get into the marketplace. And Energia, when I met them in 90, Energia was a Soviet government organization. And over the next 3 or 4 years, we helped privatize it. And it ended up being a Russian private company, which I own shares of stock in. That's capitalism. And every step of the way, NASA fought us. And I ended up representing Energia. They're a very historic, very proud organization. It was Energia that did Sputnik, the first satellite. It was Energia that did the flight of Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. They did the first space station, and so on and so forth. And now they come to America in 1990 and say, we want to work with you, but it has to be commercial. And it was NASA that had to be led into the relationship, kicking and screaming. And at the time, we wanted to understand, why did NASA fear the Russians so much? And I tell this story. This is a green badge. And at NASA, I don't know if it's still true today, but in the 90s, I think it's still true, a green badge is given to people who are foreigners when they want to go on NASA. And they're people you don't really trust. Very often they can be even escorted requirements. They escort you to the bathroom, and they just don't trust you. And I was working for Energia. I was the Washington rep for RSC Energia, and we had a meeting at the Johnson Space Center. And when I showed up, they gave me this green badge. And I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I mean, why am I getting a green badge? I'm an American. I have an American company. I represent the Russians, but, I mean, so what? This badge says I can only go to Building 2 and Building 4 South. I had never, encountered that before. And we went into this meeting, and sitting next to me was Sergei Krikalev, and he was the first Russian to fly on the space shuttle. And in the middle of the meeting, I realized that Krikalev is wearing a white badge. A white badge is what you wear when you don't need an escort. I mean, usually it's Americans that have a white badge when you're a guest at NASA, and the foreigners have the green badge. And so I stopped the meeting, and I turned to the NASA guy, and I said, why does Krikalev have a white badge? And everyone just looked, and I said, look, here's Krikalev, a loyal Russian citizen, an engineer trained in technology, loyal to Energia, and he's got a white badge. I'm a loyal American. I'm a businessman. I don't know technology. And you're escorting me into the bathroom. And it was Krikalev who answered. Krikalev said, well, when I was preparing for the shuttle, I needed to be able to go to every building and learn everything, and so they couldn't escort me, so they gave me a white badge. And I came away from that meeting understanding that at that time in the 90s, NASA did not fear technology transfer. They didn't mind that trained Russians were learning everything about our systems. What they feared, so they didn't fear Krikalev. They let him go wherever he wanted. They let him learn whatever they wanted. But what they feared was competition. And RSC Energia was and is the only organization capable of competing against NASA in space. And NASA was confronted with a situation that was really their worst nightmare. No one could have anticipated this. They were dealing with an organization that was now a private company with investors from around the world that was fully capable, just seems to go and it's okay, that was fully capable of sending people to and from space, building our space station, and they were insisting that to work together, it had to be commercial. There was a huge struggle. Clinton and Yeltsin met, and they decided the Russians and the Americans would work together. The Russians insisted to be paid. Energia insisted to be paid. And finally, the Americans agreed to pay the Russians $400 million to use the Mir. And to this day, a lot of folks at NASA have problems with that. We paid money for that. But from our viewpoint, it was commercial. And Energia was really the first commercial company to exist in space. And the fact that they're Russian is the irony. Soon after Phase 1, NASA let it be known they wanted the Mir to come down. The Russian government agreed to build 2 modules of the International Space Station, and everyone assumed that the Mir would come down. But the Prime Minister of Russia had transferred the Mir over to Energia. It now belonged to a private company. And so at one point I decided to leave working with the Russians. In fact, I left. And then there was an entrepreneur named Walt Anderson who wanted to buy the Mir, and he could not. You had to lease it. And I was brought back in to head up this company called MirCorp. And MirCorp was a Dutch company. It was 60% controlled by the Russians, 40% by the private American investors. And in January of 1999, we signed a lease to operate the Mir space station. And NASA, needless to say, was absolutely furious. And they felt that the Russian government had gone against their word. From our viewpoint, the Russian government had nothing to do with this. The Mir was a private asset controlled by a private company. And so there was a lot of misunderstanding. There was a lot of friction. A lot of people felt that the Russians had done something wrong. We set out to try and prove that a private company could operate a manned space station. And our business model was to create a commercial brand where the brand itself, the product is the message. Here we were, Russian-American cooperation. Sure, the Mir was funky. Everybody knew the Mir, I don't know if you remember this, the Mir was falling apart, but we could save it. And we poured some money into it, and we fixed it up, and you could have saved it. But NASA was insisting that you had to bring the Mir down and go forward with ISS. And it was a time of a lot of friction between the Russians and the Americans. And I'm spending this time because to try and explain to you the history of what, not only does this explain the political risk you take when you invested in space at that time, but it was from MirCorp that a lot of today's entrepreneurs use as their starting point, because we proved a lot of things. I wanted to show, I'm sorry. This is a tape from the Russians. Is there any?
The 2nd of April of the year 2000, Baikonur Cosmodrome. An ordinary technological operation is underway. Soyuz manned spaceship is being taxied to the takeoff position. An ordinary one, because this is the 89th Russian manned spaceship. And an extraordinary one, as after the 7 months of unmanned flight and plans to scuttle the station, Mir is going to be manned again. MirCorp International Company is able to keep the station in orbit. The present and the future have met here, in the integrated test facility, Soyuz, which is to take a new crew to Mir Station, and the main service model of International Space Station, which is just being built. There was a lot of heated discussions as to whether Mir should continue to be operated or it should be gone away with. After being in orbit for 14 successful years, the station seemed to be doomed. It is not so. MirCorp International Company is ready to take a challenge and save the station.
So by start of 2000, you had a situation where you had a private Dutch company which had control of what was then the world's only space station. We were out there marketing it. We were out there attracting governmental space agencies, folks in Hollywood. We signed with Mark Burnett to do a game show where the winner would go to space. We signed with James Cameron eventually we signed with James Cameron to do an IMAX film with him, where it would be on what it's like to experience a spacewalk. And from our vantage point, this is a good thing. I mean, this is something good. It's a project with American capital. It's bringing out the Russian ability in space. We're attracting new people into the space community. We had at that point 2 investors, and I think we were unsuccessful in raising further capital. I think 2 reasons. One, the political risk. NASA was out there every month, every chance it could get, saying this project goes against American interests. And then also you had the dot-com bubble burst, and a lot of the people we thought would invest with us didn't. But it was a very, very turbulent time, because at the same time we proved a lot of things. And we proved that a private operator could work with a manufacturer and safely operate a space station. And the business model for us is the aviation business today. I mean, when you fly United or you fly, JetBlue, the president of that company doesn't design, develop, and build the planes. They sell the tickets. They probably don't even have aerospace degrees. They have degrees in business development. And it falls to Boeing and Airbus to develop and manufacture the planes. And that was the MirCorp model as well. We said to the Russians, look, we'll sell the tickets, we'll get the customers, and we'll leave to you the operations and of the space assets. And we had an agreement with the Russians that was just a standard commercial lease. we would lease the station, like to the first coat of paint. And if there were any problems, they were responsible for the safety. They could make the final decisions, and we were responsible for the business side. It was extremely, extremely tough going. Every step of the way, there was a boycott by the European Space Agency, NASA. Everyone was trying to bring us down. And then we announced that our mission was going to take place, which, as Gregory mentioned, was the first and only time in history that a private company sent a crew into space. And we did that to go in, reopen the Mir, and fix it up. And I think I have a... This is them going out to the rocket.
This is also a tradition, reporting their readiness to take off. 115 cosmonauts have gone into space from Baikonur. The Latin is the 116th. The way up the steps to the elevator. The elevator will take them to the top of the rocket, to the flight spaceship's use fixed under the rocket head. It will take them to the station.
So the mission went successfully. They were up in space for 74 days. Total cost to us in cash was about $30 million. And if you know anything about the space business, you can't do anything. Two human beings in space for 74 days. It costs a little bit more than that. And they repaired the leak that had been on the Mir space station. And when they came back, we announced that we had signed with Dennis Tito. And at that point, actually, I was feeling pretty good about things, but the political risk was just too great. And so what did we learn? We learned that NASA can learn from others. There were and are other organizations out there that know space as well as NASA. We learned that cooperation does increase safety, that the more people we have, the more vehicles we have in space, the more space stations, the more cargo ships, the better. Importantly for me, commercial does have a role in manned space. We kept open the production lines for the Russians, which was critical for them meeting their federal International Space Station obligations, and also critical for this new generation of entrepreneurs. We showed that there is something called space tourism. We had debated in Washington and in the space community for years whether there would be rich business people who would pay money to go in space. And there were reports and there were studies. And then when we announced that you could buy a ticket, Dennis Tito stepped up and bought a ticket. And at that time, I did speak to Elon Musk of SpaceX, and he did speak to Bigelow, and they were watching. And a business person needs data points. I mean, those of you in the business school understand this. You need as many data points as you can get. Well, if you got one business person willing to spend tens of millions of dollars to fly in a Russian rocket to the aging space station Mir, well, if you could lower the price a little bit, maybe you'll get more people to go to a U.S. platform. Lower the price still more, suborbital, and you can begin to realize that you have a business. And so that was some of the things that were learned. On the commercial side, I'm extremely proud that when the Mir came down, we had over $160 million in backlog. And we had signed with Hollywood. We had signed with federal space agencies. And I believe that we had proved the model that there is not one path to go to space. NASA is not always the right way, and that competition is good, and that there are other ways that we can work together to do this. Moving forward from MirCorp to today's program, I don't really believe that there's too much traditional investment capital in space for the reasons I said at the start. Really today, commercial space is being funded by angel investors and the government. And I don't think you can, this is hard to read, but what this is really saying is that VCs cannot really put in, very few VCs can afford to put in 5 million to 20 million. It's just too much money for a VC, and that's too little money for space. So we have a problem today in America as we try and move on to a path of commercialization, and that is space is just extremely expensive. You can't look at VCs for support early on. And very quickly touch on some of the companies that are around today. SpaceX, Orbital Sciences, let's say SpaceX, Bigelow, XCore, these are all companies that by and by are being funded by angel investors. Spaceship One, Virgin, angel investor, kind of Northrop Grumman with a deal with Richard Branson. And then something interesting, New Mexico Spaceport. That's a whole new phenomenon taking place here where local governments are getting involved because as we're seeing these commercial ventures take off, local governments want to get involved. And I'm involved with NanoRacks, which is we're designing and developing, we'll launch in March, a small platform that will use the CubeSat form factor to do microgravity research at very low prices on the space station. And this is sort of an out-of-the-garage project, which we hope will be the beginning of very low prices for space. But these are all possible. Every one of these projects is possible today because NASA is changing. NASA is changing in the last few years, and they're accepting the fact that theirs is not the only way to space, and they cannot and should not control everything. And so today you do not have NASA competing against a Spaceship One. In fact, they're signing up as a customer of Richard Branson's suborbital plane to use it for research purposes. That's fantastic. And SpaceX, NASA has signed up as a customer to SpaceX and Orbital to pay for cargo to go to the space station. Wonderful development. NanoRacks signed a Space Act agreement with NASA, which is giving us permanent location on the space station. So NASA has learned. I think we all learned from MirCorp. I'd like to think it was MirCorp that beat everybody over the head. At least that's what you always like to think. But I think that everyone learned from MirCorp that it is possible. It is possible to do commercial space, that you can attract new players, that whether it's space tourism or commercial microgravity or media, Hollywood, space does not have to be the domain of large government projects. And what we require now to move forward is we're waiting right now, this week, this month, on a decision from the White House. And they're going to decide what path we're going to take over the next few years. And on the table right now are decisions whether the crew going forward should be commercial. Should we have Orbital Sciences and SpaceX run NASA astronauts to the space station, ferry astronauts to and from the station? As you probably know, the space shuttle is finally being retired, maybe 10 years too late, 15 years too late, but it's being retired, and we're going to have a gap. This is just extraordinarily embarrassing, and if there's anything you want to know about American space policy over the last 2 decades, we planned this so well that we are going to be relying 100% on Russians for the next 7-10 years to take our astronauts after the shuttle retires to and from the space station. I find that a national disgrace. I mean, to me, that is terrible. You can say, well, maybe I'm a little too enthusiastic on MirCorp, and maybe I was a little wrong on this. But the proof is in the fact that NASA allowed us to reach a point where we are going to be 100% dependent on the Russians to do crew transportation. And I'm happy to say, though, we're going to do it commercially. NASA won't call it commercial. They will never use that word, but they are paying the Russian companies and the Russian organizations to ferry our astronauts to and from the station. That is commercial to me, and that's the way it should be. if it's goods and services. And so that's the good part. The embarrassing part is the United States of America is going to be, not the top dog in space. And it's only our fault. And it's because we rely too long on a monolithic one agency to decide everything, in my opinion. I'm open to other reasons how we got to this point, but it's really because what we do best, open markets, competition, creativity of the private sector, none of that existed in space. It was all controlled by the equivalent of the post office, but in space. We had one agency dictating everything. And I tell people what we want now is the FedEx. And I'm sure that there were the arguments when FedEx was coming along from everybody in the post office, we don't need this. What do we need this for? We deliver the mail. What do we need the private sector? How can you trust the private sector to deliver your mail? And we're getting the same arguments today. How can we trust the private sector to send our astronauts to and from the station? How can we trust the private sector to build a space station? Well, we trust the private sector to build everything else. But space has always been that exception. What do we need? We need government as a customer. My personal bias is I don't think we need a space agency. There's no need for a space agency. We don't have an internet agency. We don't have an automobile agency. Okay, if you're going to do transportation, it becomes under the Department of Transportation. Regulatory oversight is the FAA. Research is the National Science Foundation. Why is space unique? Why is there an agency in our government which until now designs, develops, operates, and regulates? NASA is the only example in the government. Department of Agriculture doesn't own the farms. And so NASA has always been the exception. And what we need now, and it's finally happening, is government to behave more as a customer. The Pentagon's doing it. The Pentagon is buying commercial services for satellites now for the past 2 years. All the different branches of the Pentagon got together, and when they need satellite services, they procure it commercially. Same with NOAA with weather satellites. So design, develop, operations left to the market, and if we do that, I think we'll have a commercial climate, and it's a place where not only mosquitoes, but venture capitalists and angel investors, private sector, and everybody can survive in space. And finally, just to wrap it up, if you get a chance, check out, I just had a book published on what it was like for me to be an American working with the Russians, and it goes into more detail on just the anecdotes, the lessons learned of what I saw in the 90s, sitting there and watching NASA behave. I felt like the socialists, and I worked with the Russians who I felt were the capitalists. So thank you. That's it.
For a few questions, so just raise your hand, and we'll...
Yeah.
You mentioned sort of your second last slide there that the Pentagon procures satellites commercially. Could you quickly describe your feelings on the U.S. industrial defense complex, how we buy other military products?
You mean, in general, what I feel about the U.S. industrial
Defense system, how the government buys military products from the private sector?
Well, I can only speak to space. I can speak a little bit. I have found in my experience that the Pentagon is far more open to making sure we have many paths to space. They've always been far more open in supporting entrepreneurial space ventures because they never wanted to rely on NASA. They always wanted to have different launch vehicles. And I misspoke if I said they're buying satellites commercially. It's even better than that. They're now buying satellite services commercially. They're saying we don't need to own the hardware. And right now, the United States government is the largest customer for bandwidth in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, and they're keeping a lot of commercial companies afloat. So I can only touch on what I see in the space business, but always for the past, and during MirCorp, it was the Pentagon supported MirCorp. Early on with payload systems, I know I rushed through a lot of examples with you, but with payload systems, the DoD supported us. And so it's always been the Pentagon Defense Department saying, we have no problems. It's NASA saying we want, up to now, saying we want one pass. So I can only touch on that. My experience with DoD, strip away any other issues, is they're more open to commercial marketplace. Yeah.
What path are some of the other countries, Japan and China?
Well, that's a great question. The question, what are the paths? How do the other countries take it? Do space operations? Interestingly enough, other countries, let's take India and Japan, China and Russia, they have a blend between what we have done. Other nations have followed us and created a governmental space agency. I was there in Moscow in 91, 92. The Russians wanted to create a space agency made up of poets, writers, folk singers, philosophers, and it was America. Dan Golden, he said, no, you will have a space agency that mirrors, boom, boom, does this, this, and this. So the other nations have a governmental space agency. But let's use India as an example. They have a private company that reports directly to them that handles their commercial operations. And so they've solved the problem of saying when we deal with NASA and we work in space as governments, we sign governmental treaties, we do it through a space agency. But when we're doing operations, they have a private company that does the launches, that does the remote sensing. They've announced a competition to Google Earth. I mean, they have a company that does that. China, they have a small centralized space agency, and they have this huge equivalent to Energia. It's called PASA, that has like 30 subdivisions. That's in the Chinese way on defense conversion, is a company that does the operations. But the point I would say to you is I don't care how the other nations do it because other nations do not have as open a marketplace as we do. What is correct to say is the other nations have done it their normal, typical way. The French and the Germans, and they all have European Space Agency, and it's done in the European way, no different than Airbus or anything. Space for us has been done differently than we do everything else. Space, because it came out of the space program, came out of the Cold War, came out of Kennedy, and it took on a life of its own. So our space agency is more, I believe, an exception to the way we do things normally than in other countries. They do it more within their way of the government-industry partnership. That answers the question.
Can you just explain how it's cost-effective, I guess, for the Russians to continue to operate a space, whatever their version of the space shuttle is, which I don't think is any more advanced than newer than the space shuttle, right? During this period when the space shuttle is being retired.
It's not. Well, it's a good question. I'll put it. The question was how can the Russians continue when we have problems with our shuttle? The Russians don't have a shuttle. They had a shuttle. It was called Buran, Russian for snowflake. It flew once unmanned, and then they retired it because they realized it wasn't going anywhere. They have a rocket called the Soyuz, and it's confusing because they have a rocket called a Soyuz, and they have the upper stage where the people are. That's also called the Soyuz, and the Soyuz is inexpensive, has not been modified except for little safety things in 30 years. The cost, I happen to know the cost of a Soyuz. It's very low. NASA's paying $50 million for a seat. It holds 3 people. One is the commander. The 2 can be visitors. And they're now charging between $30 and $50 million a seat, and they're making a huge profit. The space shuttle costs, you want to take a guess, $700 million a flight, $600 million a flight. It was just a waste. It was colossal. We lost 14 lives in the last 20-something years, 2 fatalities of the shuttle. Fortunately, there's been no fatalities in the Soyuz for 30, 35 years. So the Russians have stayed with something that worked. And even today, with wages and inflation in Russia, they can deliver that sucker for far less. They launch on time, through all sorts of weather, and it's proven, same with their cargo ship. And so they just have a proven resource, they stuck with it, and every time we have something, we say, oh, let's get rid of this, and let's do something new. And then we start the cycle all over again. So I think that's the answer to the question.
It seems like NASA's really hindered you in your endeavors, but I mean, what advantage is it for NASA to try to slow down, future space companies?
Well, let me say now I'm trying to work with NASA. NASA's trying to work with people like me now. I think they see the light a little bit. But prior to that, I go back to the analogy of the post office. It's just government folks who know their way. They use arguments, to be fair, their arguments for space is too dangerous, space is a frontier, space should not be left to the private sector are capitalists, we can't have profit as part of this. That sounds like socialist, communist to me. I can't answer in one sense why, but I can because I sat in on those meetings. And they were just folks who had spent their entire lives in the government, and space has always been part of the government, and they could not envision a private sector role for space. And that's just, go talk to them. So.
Are you and other people such as yourself thinking about other business opportunities in space aside from tourism?
Well, sure. NanoRacks, we're looking at low-cost microgravity research. I can fly, starting in March, I can fly a 30-day mission to the space station. You get data down every day, and you got voltage and et cetera. 30 days for $25,000. Now that's cheap by space standards. That is very cheap to do a 30-day mission, microgravity mission to the space station for 25 grand. With that kind of thing, your departments can afford that. Corporations can afford to fail, try something new. That's always been lacking. And so we're looking at science, but now we're at the very beginning. We're looking at infrastructure development. Bigelow in Vegas is building a commercial orbiting facility. You have launch vehicles. We're at the beginning now. We're almost not, with the exception of something like NanoRacks, most of the entrepreneurial ventures are focused on building the infrastructure because it has decayed under NASA. Is that fair? It's decayed. Let me just say the American infrastructure has decayed. And it's like injection of new capital, new ideas. We're all trying to think of new things to do. At NanoRacks, we're also working on games that would be based in space. And we're just trying to think of, put it into a new generation, a new era. So.
It seems like, even though the space industry is kind of taking off and it's going to be profitable soon, do you believe it in the near future get to be widespread and profitable, and if so, and maybe how long?
If NASA continues, if the U.S. government continues to behave as a customer, you have a new opportunity in a new marketplace. NASA spends $19 billion a year. That's not a lot, it's not a little. But if they behave as a customer and they begin to request services, yes, I can see the formation of a whole new generation of companies to meet the request. To use all these analogies, when the government needs cars, they don't design, develop the cars, they go out and buy them. When they go to Europe, they buy tickets. If they start to behave as a customer and say, you know what, we're going to go to the moon. We want 4 people to be able to go to the moon for 30 days, and they put out a bid. If they do something like that, it's a wonderful time. It'll be just a fascinating time. But if they continue to hang on to it and say, we're sending 4 people, and Lockheed, this is how we want you to design and develop it, and then no, then it's gone. So, yes, sir.
The example that you just gave with, putting out a bid for sending people to the moon or even Mars, do you believe that a private company could do that faster and cheaper than NASA?
Yes. Yes, of course. Yes. Again, private sector, once it's matured. Today, neither of us can do it, unfortunately. Neither NASA nor the private sector. But when mature, if we start today with SpaceX and Orbital Sciences doing cargo, and then if the Obama administration decides that those companies can send out astronauts, and then from there, Bigelow does the spacecraft, and then if we take it over the next few years and the true private sector develops, then my answer would be the private sector always does it faster than the government. That's why the United States is the leader in this. And so I'd rather fly on a private sector rocket than a government rocket. Right? So.
I've read a number of space policy journal articles in the journal Space Policy. And the biggest complaint that they have is there is this lack of coherent regulation and policy, both here in the United States and abroad. How much policy and regulatory work or establishing policy and regulatory structure would we need to do in order to change this from a government operation into a commercial operation?
We need to, as that slide said, we need to continue the momentum of the government as customer. And the word, two things we need. One is that, and the word is Obama's moving in that direction. And second, I don't know how many of you are familiar with ITAR, the bane of our existence, but it's the technology review. We need to relax that a little bit. So if MIT fraternity guys build a small satellite and wants to launch with the Russians, you don't need State Department permission. Okay, so just a certain example. So it's not so much the policy as the mindset.
When the private sector really starts maturing, what's it going to be like to deal with a customer that can pass laws and print its own money?
Well, I mean, every company, I mean, it's a great question, like Microsoft, every company has a government division. You always have to handle the government a little differently. And so and I've spoken to guys in the technology sectors, and I was talking to somebody who I won't name him, who's just now setting up for the first time a government division. And so it's a great question, you always have to treat the government differently. They move at their own speed, they're slow, they're arrogant, and you just have to deal with it. And so the answer will be, it will be unpleasant, but at $19 billion a year, if they want to go to the moon and going to have companies do it, great. I mean, what do you do?
You mentioned NASA growing sort of into this problem from a long time ago. I'm curious how much of the legacy of, like, you mentioned NASA coming out of the Cold War and race to the moon being us versus the Russians. Is that legacy of the people that are still entrenched in NASA, is that who you think you're fighting against when you fight against commercialization of space? Or what body of knowledge is saying, from NASA is saying, we're the best and we're the only ones that should be doing this?
I think we're fighting against pride. I think we're fighting against an organization that at one point was the greatest organization in the world. I mean, at one point, NASA, the moment Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, NASA was the greatest organization in the world. And for whatever reason, I've suggested a reason today, it's gone downhill since that moment. And so I think there is a pride still in the hallways that we took, Neil Armstrong and everyone to the moon and safely returned them. And that's what you're fighting against. And that you come in and say, hey, there's a guy named Elon Musk, and he's from the West Coast, and he's got these electric cars, and he says he can fly to space better than you. And that's the way they look at it. And so I think there's this cultural clash. And it must have happened, I wasn't involved, but when IBM was selling mainframes to the government, and Apple came in and said, hey, would you buy our and PCs came in, there must have been that same clash. That how can we go from mainframes to smaller computers? How can, you probably don't know Wangs and all the other folks who were selling computers. So there's probably that same transition that needs to be done from the big mainframes down into cutting edge private sector. And I think it's just pride.
What are your thoughts on Constellation? Do you think NASA should proceed with it, or do you think they should step down and let the...
What do you think? I think this is not the time for the United States space program to embark on another open-ended, multi-billion-dollar project where we're not sure what we're doing, why we're doing it, where we're going. This is not the time. Maybe soon, maybe 2, 3, 4 years we can do that. This is a time to figure out how NASA's going to behave with the private sector. I'm hopeful this administration is going to set more in stone that NASA behaves as a customer, and that the United States' policy, if it says we're going to go to the moon, you do it in stepping stones with the private sector growing each step of the way. I got a problem with these big centralized government pronouncements. We are going to the moon. Remember, we can only appropriate 1 year at a time. So when the president in the White House says we're going to the moon, he's relying on a Congress 15 sessions from now to finish that. That's been our problem. There's a problem with the shuttle. It's a problem with space station. Under our political system, you can't appropriate 5, 10 years ahead. So I got a major, that's a whole nother issue. We got major problems in how we do these long lead times. If the government behaves as a customer, you can have private capital come in. But right now, Congress doesn't appropriate 6 years from now. So I got a problem with the way it's done, so I wouldn't be in favor at this time now, us announcing it, and I would have zero faith. Bush announced it, Bush 1 announced us going to the moon, All sorts of people have announced it's going to the moon. I don't believe it. We got to fix the program. Maybe one more question. Yes.
Do you have any idea of how much money it would take? What kind of initial investment you would need for one of these private space companies?
Well, it depends what you're doing. I mean, Elon has put probably $300-400 million, and he's failed on 3 launch vehicles, and he's probably going to end up, the cash flow hole will be $500-700 million. Bigelow has said he's put $400-500 million, I think. Most of his net worth may be less. Orbital is the only one, Orbital Sciences, that has done it the more traditional way. They got some government contracts, they then went public, and they've been using shareholder money in government contracts. That was the only exception up there. If you're talking about developing a launch vehicle, you're looking at $500 million minimum, and you need a customer. If you talk about infrastructure in space, you know, folks here in Michigan, University of Michigan, I'm working on CubeSats and CubeLabs, or the smaller things, those cost a lot less. I mean, at NanoRacks, we're funding this through credit cards and you know, everything else. And so it really depends on what you want to do, but if you're talking about a launch vehicle, that's big money. And you need a customer, and that becomes a government. So, last question? Anybody?
I just want to know your interest in this. Is it commercial, where the space is open to the private industry, where industry can make money, or want to bring space to a common man who can afford this space travel? What is your interest in this?
Well, those are not two mutually exclusive. They're parallel. I would say my vision of space is that where you have a private marketplace where competition thrives. And people pay for goods and services. Up to now, when NASA wanted something from Russia or India, they said, oh, we're NASA, and you signed a government-to-government agreement, and no money exchanged hands. And so, yes, I hope the result of commercial is more and more people experience space, and we do things, and a whole bunch of reasons we should be in space. But the way I would answer that is space has to be a market like any other place where competition thrives, and no one government agency controls the whole sector. Okay, thank you. Thanks, guys.